Sarah Chen had always been different from other girls in her small Texas town. While her friends painted their nails and talked about weekend parties, she spent hours at the local gym, pushing her body to limits that made grown men wince. Her dream was simple but ambitious: become a United States Marine. At 19, with determination burning in her dark eyes, she finally got her chance. The bus ride to Marine Corps Recruit Depot Paris Island felt like a journey to another world. Sarah pressed her face against the window, watching the South Carolina landscape blur past. Her stomach churned with a mixture of excitement and terror. She had read every book, watched every documentary, and prepared for months. But nothing could truly prepare someone for what lay ahead. The moment the bus doors opened, reality hit like a physical blow. Drill instructors swarmed the new recruits, their voices cutting through the humid air like knives. Sarah's ears rang as she was herded off the bus with 30 other terrified young people. The yellow footprints painted on the asphalt seemed to glow in the harsh overhead lights, and she quickly found her place among them. "You think you're tough?" Drill instructor Rodriguez screamed inches from Sarah's face, his breath hot against her cheek. "You think because you did some push-ups in high school, you're ready to be a Marine?" Sarah kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, her jaw clenched so tight her teeth ached. She had expected this, but experiencing it was entirely different. The first few weeks passed in a blur of exhaustion and constant pressure. Sarah discovered muscles she never knew existed as they screamed in protest during endless physical training sessions. The obstacle course became her daily nemesis. A collection of walls, ropes, and barriers that seemed designed by someone who hated the human body. Yet she persevered, driven by a fire that burned deeper than physical pain. What Sarah didn't expect was the subtle hostility from some of her fellow male recruits. It started small: snide comments during chow time, deliberate shoulder bumps in formation, whispered jokes about women not belonging in combat roles. Most of the female recruits in her platoon kept their heads down and tried to blend in, but Sarah's competitive nature made her a target. Private Johnson, a hulking farm boy from Iowa, seemed particularly invested in making Sarah's life difficult. He had old-fashioned ideas about women's roles and made no effort to hide his resentment about sharing barracks with females. During rifle training, he would accidentally knock over her gear. In the mess hall, he would spread rumors about special treatment for women recruits. Sarah ignored it all, focusing instead on exceeding every standard set before her. The physical demands intensified as weeks turned into months. Sarah's body transformed from soft civilian flesh into lean muscle and callous determination. She could complete the obstacle course faster than half the men in her platoon. Her pull-up count exceeded requirements, and her marksmanship scores consistently ranked in the top 5. But success only seemed to increase the resentment from certain quarters. One evening, as Sarah prepared for lights out, she noticed something was wrong. Her carefully maintained gear had been disturbed. Small things at first. Her uniform folded incorrectly, her toiletries rearranged. She said nothing. Understanding this was part of the psychological warfare that came with military training. But the incidents escalated. During a particularly grueling week of field exercises, Sarah woke to find sand in her weapon. The sabotage could have resulted in serious consequences during inspection, but she caught it in time, spending precious sleep hours cleaning and re-cleaning her rifle until it gleamed. Still, she kept quiet, determined not to be seen as someone who couldn't handle the pressure. The harassment took on a more organized feel as time passed. Sarah would find her bunk stripped and remake it perfectly, only to return from training to find it destroyed again. Her boots would mysteriously disappear, forcing her to search frantically before formation. Each incident was small enough to seem like coincidence, but together, they painted a clear picture of coordinated intimidation. Sarah's breaking point came during a surprise night inspection. Drill instructor Rodriguez burst into the barracks at 0200 hours, flashlight cutting through the darkness like a sword. Every recruit scrambled to attention beside their perfectly made bunks, but when the light hit Sarah's area, her heart sank. Her footlocker had been opened, and its contents scattered across the floor in deliberate chaos. What is this disaster, recruit? Rodriguez's voice could have shattered glass. Sarah's mind raced as she stared at the mess she knew she hadn't made. Her carefully folded uniforms lay twisted on the floor, her personal items scattered like confetti. I don't know, sir," she stammered, knowing how weak it sounded. The punishment was swift and brutal. While her platoon mates returned to sleep, Sarah spent the rest of the night cleaning the entire barracks floor with a toothbrush. Her knees bled through her uniform pants as she scrubbed, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the humiliation burning in her chest. She could hear muffled laughter from some of the bunks, and she knew exactly who was responsible. The campaign against her intensified after that night. Sarah's gear would be sabotaged before important inspections. Her personal items would disappear, and she would find herself blamed for infractions she didn't commit. The stress began to show in her performance. Her usually perfect uniform inspections resulted in demerits. Her room failed standards she had always exceeded, and exhaustion crept into her physical training scores. What hurt most was the silence from recruits she had considered friends. Fear of becoming targets themselves kept most of her platoon mates neutral, unwilling to stand up for her or even acknowledge what was obviously happening. Sarah found herself increasingly isolated, fighting not just the demands of Marine training but a psychological war that threatened to break her spirit. The worst incident came during combat training week. Sarah had been looking forward to this phase, confident that her physical preparation would finally pay off. The exercise involved a 20-mile tactical march through difficult terrain, carrying full gear and weapons. It was designed to test every limit a recruit possessed, and Sarah had trained specifically for this moment. She woke that morning with anticipation coursing through her veins. The march would separate the Marines from those who couldn't handle the pressure, and she was determined to prove she belonged among the elite. Sarah went through her pre-march ritual carefully, checking every piece of equipment, ensuring her boots were properly laced, and mentally preparing for the grueling hours ahead. But when she reached for her boots, they weren't there. Sarah's blood ran cold as she stared at the empty space where her perfectly broken-in combat boots should have been. She dropped to her knees, frantically searching under her bunk, in her footlocker, anywhere they might have been misplaced. Other recruits were already forming up outside, the sound of their boots on pavement echoing through the barracks. "Looking for something, Chen?" Johnson's voice dripped with false concern as he laced up his own boots nearby. Sarah's hands shook as she continued searching, knowing with absolute certainty that her boots had been deliberately taken. The march was scheduled to begin in minutes, and without proper footwear, she would be forced to drop out, possibly facing dismissal from the program entirely. Sarah's mind raced through her options. She could report the theft, but without proof, it would look like she was making excuses. She could refuse to participate and accept the consequences, but that would mean abandoning everything she had worked toward. Or she could find another way to prove that she belonged here, regardless of what obstacles were placed in her path. The sound of drill instructor Rodriguez's voice booming across the parade ground made her decision for her. "Fall in! March begins in 60 seconds!" Sarah looked down at her bare feet, then at the faces of the recruits who had made her life a living hell. Something hardened inside her chest, a resolve that went deeper than pride or stubbornness. She would march barefoot, 20 miles through rough terrain, carrying 60 pounds of gear, with nothing protecting her feet but determination and sheer willpower. It was impossible, dangerous, and probably insane, but as Sarah stood and walked toward the formation, she knew it was the only way to prove that she would not be broken, no matter what they threw at her. The formation was a sea of polished boots and pressed uniforms when Sarah took her place in line. Her bare feet felt cold against the asphalt, and she could already sense curious glances from nearby recruits. Drill instructor Rodriguez paced in front of the assembled platoon like a caged predator, his eagle eyes scanning for any imperfection that would give him an excuse to unleash hell. "Today, you will discover what it means to push beyond your perceived limitations," Rodriguez announced, his voice carrying across the morning air. "This march will break some of you. It will reveal who has the heart of a Marine and who should have stayed home with their mothers." His gaze swept across the formation and stopped when it reached Sarah's position. Rodriguez's eyes narrowed as he noticed her bare feet. For a moment, time seemed suspended as the drill instructor processed what he was seeing. Sarah kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, her jaw set in determination. She could feel the weight of his stare and knew that her decision would either end her military career or define it. "Recruit Chen." Rodriguez's voice was deadly quiet. "Explain to me why you are standing in my formation without proper footwear." The entire platoon seemed to hold its breath. Sarah could feel Johnson's smirk without even looking in his direction. This was the moment they had all been waiting for, the final nail in the coffin of her Marine Corps dreams. "No excuse, sir," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the tornado of emotions swirling inside her. She could have explained about the missing boots, could have pointed fingers, and made accusations. But she understood that doing so would only confirm what her tormentors believed about her. That she was weak. That she would look for excuses when things got difficult. Rodriguez stepped closer, his face inches from hers. "Are you telling me, recruit, that you intend to complete a 20-mile tactical march through rough terrain without boots?" His voice was so low that only Sarah and a few nearby recruits could hear him clearly. There was something in his tone that wasn't quite what she expected. Not anger, but something that might have been curiosity. "Yes, sir," Sarah replied without hesitation. She had made her choice, and there was no backing down now. The consequences of failure would be swift and final, but the alternative, giving up and proving her enemies right, was unthinkable. Around her, she could hear whispers beginning to ripple through the formation as word of what was happening spread. Rodriguez stared at her for what felt like an eternity. Sarah could see something shifting in his expression, a calculation taking place behind his stern facade. Finally, he stepped back and addressed the entire platoon. "Recruit Chen has volunteered to demonstrate the meaning of adaptation and overcome. She will complete this march with the rest of you, regardless of her footwear situation." The march began at a punishing pace. Sarah's platoon moved out in formation, their boots creating a rhythmic thunder against the paved road that led away from the base. For the first mile, Sarah managed to keep up without too much difficulty. The asphalt was relatively smooth, and adrenaline helped mask the growing discomfort in her feet. But as the platoon turned onto a dirt trail that wound through dense woodland, Sarah's situation became dramatically more challenging. Rocks, roots, and thorny undergrowth created a minefield of obstacles that her unprotected feet had to navigate with each step. Within minutes, she could feel cuts opening on her soles, warm blood beginning to seep between her toes. The weight of her full gear pressed down on her shoulders like a crushing burden. The standard Marine field pack weighed 60 pounds when properly loaded, and Sarah carried every required item: ammunition, rations, water, medical supplies, and communications equipment. Every pound seemed to multiply as her feet began to fail her, each step becoming a conscious act of will rather than natural movement. By mile 3, Sarah's feet were leaving bloody prints on the trail. The other recruits had begun to notice, and she could hear whispered conversations behind her. Some voices carried notes of concern, others held barely concealed satisfaction at her obvious suffering. Sarah focused on putting one foot in front of the other, blocking out everything except the need to keep moving forward. The terrain grew progressively more challenging as the march continued. Rocky creek beds that were merely uncomfortable for booted feet became exercises in agony for Sarah. Sharp stones cut into her already wounded soles, and the cold water that should have provided relief instead sent shocks of pain up her legs. She bit her lip to keep from crying out, tasting blood as her teeth cut too deep. Johnson, marching just behind her, seemed to take particular pleasure in her struggles. "You know you can quit any time, Chen," he whispered during a brief water break. "Nobody expects you to actually finish this. Just fall out and let the medics patch you up." His voice carried a false sympathy that made Sarah's skin crawl. She turned to face him, her eyes blazing with determination that surprised them both. "I'm not quitting," she said simply. The certainty in her voice seemed to rattle Johnson more than any angry response could have. He had expected her to break by now, to prove his theories about women's capabilities correct. Instead, she was becoming something he hadn't anticipated. A symbol of stubborn resilience that challenged everything he believed about strength and determination. As the miles accumulated, word of Sarah's barefoot march began to spread beyond her immediate platoon. Other training groups passed them going in opposite directions, and Sarah could see recruits craning their necks to get a glimpse of the crazy woman attempting the impossible. Some shouted encouragement, others stared in disbelief. But all seemed to recognize that they were witnessing something extraordinary. The pain in Sarah's feet evolved from sharp cuts to a constant burning agony. Blisters had formed and burst, leaving raw patches of exposed flesh that screamed with every step. Her boots were designed to protect feet from exactly this kind of punishment, and without them, the human body simply wasn't built to handle such abuse. Yet Sarah continued moving, one bloody step at a time. By mile 10, Sarah's gait had changed noticeably. She could no longer place her full weight on certain parts of her feet, forcing her to develop an awkward but functional stride that minimized contact with the worst injuries. Her pace had slowed, and she found herself falling toward the back of the formation. But she was still moving, still part of the march, still refusing to surrender. The psychological pressure was almost as difficult as the physical pain. Every step required a conscious decision to continue, a moment when she could have chosen to stop, to call for medical assistance, to end the suffering that was accomplishing nothing except proving a point that maybe wasn't worth proving. Doubt crept in like a poison, whispering that this was foolish, that she was destroying her feet for nothing more than pride. But each time the voice of surrender grew loud enough to threaten her resolve, Sarah would remember the smug satisfaction on Johnson's face when he had taunted her about her missing boots. She would recall every small humiliation, every act of sabotage, every moment when she had been treated as less than equal. The pain in her feet became fuel for a deeper fire that burned in her chest. The midpoint of the march was marked by a checkpoint, where drill instructors verified that each recruit was carrying all required equipment and remained physically capable of continuing. Sarah approached the checkpoint with dread, knowing that any reasonable assessment would result in her immediate removal from the march for medical reasons. Drill instructor Rodriguez was stationed at the checkpoint, his clipboard ready to mark off each passing recruit. When Sarah approached, she could see him taking in the condition of her feet with professional assessment. Blood had soaked through her socks and was now visible in every footprint she left behind. The wounds were clearly serious, potentially requiring medical attention that could take weeks to heal properly. "Recruit Chen," Rodriguez said quietly, his voice lacking its usual harsh edge. "You've proven your point. Nobody would question your courage if you accepted medical attention now." For a moment, Sarah thought she heard something almost like respect in his tone. But she couldn't be sure. What she was certain of was that this was her last chance to quit, with honor intact. Sarah met his gaze directly. "Permission to continue the march, sir." Her voice was hoarse from the effort of suppressing pain, but it carried absolute conviction. Rodriguez studied her face for several long moments, as if trying to read something written in the lines of exhaustion and determination that had formed there. "Very well," he said finally. "But you will accept a medical escort for the remainder of the march. If your condition deteriorates to the point where you pose a danger to yourself or others, you will be removed immediately." Sarah nodded her agreement, understanding that this was likely the best compromise she could hope for. The second half of the march began with a Navy corpsman assigned to monitor Sarah's condition. Hospital Corpsman Williams was a compact, efficient man who had seen enough injuries to recognize both serious medical conditions and remarkable human endurance. He introduced himself quietly and began walking beside Sarah without making a show of his presence. "I've been watching you for the last few miles," Williams said conversationally as they resumed the march. "What you're doing isn't medically advisable, but I have to admit I've never seen anything quite like it." His tone was professional but carried a note of genuine curiosity about what drove someone to push through such obvious physical distress. The terrain in the second half of the march proved even more challenging than the first. The trail wound through swampy areas where hidden roots and submerged rocks created treacherous footing even for properly equipped Marines. For Sarah, each step became a careful negotiation between forward progress and avoiding obstacles that could cause catastrophic injury to her already damaged feet. Her platoon mates had begun to change their attitude toward her as the miles accumulated. The whispers of mockery had been replaced by something approaching awe. Even recruits who had initially supported Johnson's harassment campaign found themselves impressed by Sarah's refusal to quit. Whatever their opinions about women in combat roles, they couldn't deny that they were witnessing an extraordinary display of mental toughness. The pain had evolved beyond simple physical sensation into something that occupied Sarah's entire consciousness. Each step required negotiating with her body, convincing her nervous system to accept another round of punishment. Her feet had gone numb in some places and screamed with hypersensitive agony in others. Blood loss and dehydration were beginning to affect her balance and coordination, yet somehow, impossibly, she kept moving forward. The final 5 miles stretched ahead like an impossible mountain. Sarah's vision had begun to blur at the edges, and she could feel her body beginning to shut down non-essential functions to preserve energy for the basic act of moving forward. Corpsman Williams stayed close, monitoring her pulse and watching for signs that her determination might be pushing her body beyond its ability to recover. Around mile 16, something unexpected happened. Private Martinez, one of the quieter recruits who had never participated in the harassment campaign, began to slow his pace until he was walking beside Sarah. Without saying a word, he shifted his position slightly so that his body blocked some of the wind that had been cutting through her sweat-soaked uniform. The gesture was small but significant, the first open show of support she had received from any of her fellow recruits. Within minutes, others began to follow Martinez's example. Private Davis moved closer to Sarah's other side, and soon a small group of recruits had formed a protective formation around her. They didn't speak about what they were doing, but their message was clear. Whatever had started this march as a cruel joke had transformed into something else entirely. A test that Sarah was passing in ways that shamed her tormentors. Johnson, still marching near the group, watched this development with growing anger and disbelief. His plan to humiliate Sarah and prove his point about women's weaknesses had backfired completely. Instead of breaking down and quitting, she was inspiring other recruits to rally around her. The narrative he had tried to create about female weakness was crumbling with every bloody step she took. "This is ridiculous," Johnson muttered to another recruit who had been part of his campaign against Sarah. "She's going to hurt herself permanently for what? To prove some feminist point?" But his words carried less conviction than before, and even his closest allies were beginning to distance themselves from his increasingly desperate rhetoric. The physical toll on Sarah had become catastrophic. Her feet were no longer recognizable as human appendages, but rather as raw, bleeding masses of damaged tissue, held together by willpower alone. Each step left a clear print of blood and torn flesh on the trail behind her. The pain had transcended normal sensation and become a constant, overwhelming presence that threatened to consume her consciousness entirely. Corpsman Williams had grown increasingly concerned as he monitored Sarah's vital signs. Her pulse was elevated far beyond normal exertion levels, her breathing had become shallow and rapid, and her skin had taken on a pale, clammy appearance that suggested her body was beginning to go into shock. "Chen," he said quietly, "I need you to be honest with me. Are you experiencing any chest pain or difficulty breathing beyond normal exertion?" Sarah considered the question carefully. Her chest did feel tight, and each breath seemed to require conscious effort. But she couldn't tell if this was due to physical distress or simply the overwhelming nature of the pain radiating from her feet. "I'm okay," she said, though her voice sounded weak even to her own ears. "I can finish this." Williams frowned but didn't immediately override her assessment. He had seen Marines push through incredible physical challenges before, and part of his job was distinguishing between dangerous medical conditions and the normal suffering that came with extreme military training. Sarah's determination was remarkable, but he needed to ensure it didn't become suicidal. As the platoon crested a hill that revealed the final 3 miles of the march, a commotion erupted from the front of the formation. Word was spreading that senior drill instructors from other platoons had gathered at various points along the remaining route. Sarah's barefoot march had become legendary within the training battalion, and Marines who had completed their own training months earlier were coming out to witness the conclusion of what many were calling the most remarkable display of recruit determination they had ever seen. The attention was both inspiring and overwhelming. Sarah had begun this march as a private act of defiance against her tormentors, but it had evolved into something much larger. She was no longer just proving her own worth. She was representing something fundamental about the Marine Corps values of perseverance and adaptation in the face of impossible circumstances. With 2 miles remaining, Sarah's left foot stepped on a particularly sharp rock that opened a deep gash along her arch. The pain was so intense that her vision went white for a moment, and she stumbled badly enough that Martinez had to catch her arm to keep her upright. Blood flowed freely from the new wound, adding to the crimson trail that marked her passage. "That's enough," Corpsman Williams said firmly. "Chen, you've proven whatever point you set out to prove. That wound needs immediate medical attention, and you're risking permanent damage to your feet." He was already reaching for his radio to call for a medical evacuation, but Sarah's hand shot out to stop him. "Please," she said, her voice breaking for the first time during the entire march. 2 more miles. I've come this far." Tears mixed with sweat on her face, but her eyes still burned with the same determination that had carried her 16 miles on ruined feet. "I need to finish this. Not for them. Not for anyone else. For me." Williams looked into her eyes and saw something that made him hesitate. In his years of military medical service, he had learned to recognize the difference between dangerous bravado and genuine inner strength. Sarah wasn't pushing forward out of pride or stubbornness anymore. She was drawing on something deeper, a well of determination that went to the core of who she was as a person. 2 miles, he said finally. "But I'm calling for immediate medical support at the finish line. And if you collapse before then, I'm stopping this march immediately." Sarah nodded her agreement, grateful beyond words that he was giving her the chance to complete what she had started. The final 2 miles passed in a blur of pain and determination that existed beyond normal human experience. Sarah's consciousness narrowed to a single focus. The next step, then the next, then the next. After that, the world around her faded until there was nothing but the trail ahead and the burning need to reach its end. Other recruits had begun to notice something profound happening within their platoon. The protective formation around Sarah had grown larger, and even some of the recruits who had initially supported Johnson's campaign were now openly supporting her effort. The march had become a shared experience that transcended the petty divisions and prejudices that had seemed so important just hours earlier. Johnson found himself increasingly isolated as his former allies abandoned his cause. The woman he had tried to break was not only surviving but inspiring others in ways that made his harassment campaign look small and mean-spirited by comparison. The narrative about female weakness that he had used to justify his actions was being destroyed by the simple act of one person refusing to surrender. With half a mile remaining, Sarah could see the finish line in the distance. A crowd of drill instructors, completed recruits, and training staff had gathered to witness the conclusion of her march. The sight of so many people waiting to see if she could complete the impossible task gave her a final surge of energy that she hadn't known she still possessed. The last quarter mile was lined with Marines who had heard about Sarah's march and come to show their support. They stood at attention in their dress uniforms, creating an honor guard for a recruit who had demonstrated something essential about the Marine Corps spirit. As Sarah approached, some began to clap slowly. Others called out words of encouragement, but most simply watched in respectful silence. Rodriguez appeared beside the trail as Sarah entered the final 100 yards. The stern drill instructor, who had seemed so intimidating on her first day at Paris Island, now looked at her with something that might have been pride. "Outstanding, recruit," he said quietly as she passed. "You have shown us all what it means to be a Marine." The finish line was marked by a simple banner stretched between 2 poles. As Sarah approached it, her legs finally began to give out. The adrenaline that had carried her through the final miles was depleting, and her body was beginning to shut down. But she could see the banner ahead, so close that she could almost touch it. With her last reserves of strength, Sarah broke into a stumbling run for the final 20 yards. Her damaged feet screamed in protest, but she ignored them completely. The crowd of watching Marines began to cheer as they realized what she was attempting. Even Johnson, watching from the back of the gathered platoon, found himself holding his breath. Sarah crashed through the finish line and immediately collapsed to her knees on the asphalt. Blood pooled beneath her feet, and her entire body shook with exhaustion and relief. She had done it. 20 miles through rough terrain, carrying full combat gear, on feet that had been destroyed by the journey. It was impossible, but she had made it possible, through sheer force of will. Corpsman Williams was beside her immediately, along with a full medical team that began working to stabilize her condition and assess the damage to her feet. As they loaded her onto a stretcher for transport to the base medical facility, Sarah looked back at her platoon. Many of the recruits who had tormented her for months now looked at her with something approaching awe. Others seemed ashamed of their earlier behavior. Johnson stood apart from the group, his face a mixture of anger and confusion. The woman he had tried to break had instead broken something inside him. His certainty about female weakness, his justifications for treating her as less than equal, his belief that might made right. The boots he had hidden as a cruel joke had become the foundation for a legend that would outlast his military career. As the ambulance pulled away from the training grounds, Rodriguez gathered the platoon for debrief. His usual harsh demeanor had been replaced by something more thoughtful, more reflective. "Today you witnessed something extraordinary," he began. "You saw what happens when a Marine refuses to accept limitations imposed by others or by circumstances. Some of you participated in actions that were designed to break that recruit's spirit," he continued, his gaze settling on Johnson and his allies. "Instead, you created the conditions for her to demonstrate courage that will be remembered long after you have all forgotten the petty grievances that motivated your behavior." The consequences for Johnson and the others involved in the harassment campaign came swiftly. Military justice moved quickly when the facts were clear, and their actions had been witnessed by too many people to be denied or minimized. Some faced formal disciplinary action. Others were recycled to begin their training over again. And Johnson himself was ultimately dismissed from the program. But the real consequences were deeper and more personal. They had participated in something cruel and discovered that their victim was stronger than they had imagined. The experience forced a reckoning with their own character that would follow them for years to come. Sarah spent 3 weeks in the medical facility, while doctors worked to repair the damage to her feet. The injuries were severe. Multiple fractures, deep lacerations, and tissue damage that required skin grafts to heal properly. But her spirits remained high throughout the recovery period, buoyed by a stream of visitors who came to pay their respects to the recruit who had redefined what was possible. When she returned to training, Sarah found that everything had changed. The harassment had completely stopped, replaced by a respect that went beyond mere acceptance. Her fellow recruits looked at her differently now, not as a woman trying to prove she belonged, but as a Marine who had already proven it in the most dramatic way imaginable. The story of Sarah's barefoot march spread throughout the Marine Corps and beyond. Military publications wrote articles about her determination, and her photograph, taken as she crossed the finish line with blood streaming from her feet, became an iconic image of perseverance in the face of impossible odds. But for Sarah, the most important victory was personal. She had faced her worst enemies and discovered that she was stronger than they had ever imagined. The boots they had hidden in an attempt to humiliate her had instead provided the opportunity for her to demonstrate courage that inspired others and changed lives. Sometimes, Sarah realized, the cruelest obstacles could become the foundation for the greatest triumphs.